You are listening to All In, a podcast dedicated to helping you fulfill the mission of God in your life and around the world. I'm your host, Jeff Roper. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of All In. So glad that you have joined with me today. Today, I want to ask a question, and that is, do dead theologians matter today? You know, you hear a lot of talk about being the church of what's happening now, cutting edge, all of this stuff that frankly, over time makes me wonder, should we listen to our ancestors? Should we listen to those who have trodden the path before us? I love this quote from G.K. Chesterton, one of my favorite authors. He said, "Tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is a democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about." Today, we're going to explore, do dead theologians matter? And we're going to actually take a deep dive into one of my favorite dead theologians, Maximus the Confessor. And I could think of nobody better to guide us in this conversation than my friend Steve Overman from Eugene Faith Center. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. Nice to hear your voice.
It's so good to have you on the podcast. You know, what got me started on this specific conversation was, I think it was 2 summers ago, you and I were together in Montana doing some fly fishing with some other guys. And one night you and I just got to geeking out on patristic theology, especially around Maximus. And I thought this was so exciting that other people should hear this conversation.
And that was a very enjoyable setting and an enjoyable conversation as well.
I really enjoyed it. You wrote 2 very insightful articles regarding Maximus the Confessor, and I'd like to really dive into both of those, and we will have these available for download on our website in the show notes, so those that are listening that would like to actually read these. Now, these are scholarly articles. I think they're probably both peer-reviewed articles as well, and they're scholarly, well-referenced, but very insightful, and I would encourage any of you to take the time to read them. Steve, help me unpack both of these. One of them is titled Materiality, Beauty, and Space, the Eastern Traditions as a Ressourcement for Pentecostal Worship and the Arts. Now, that's a fancy title, my friend. Can you unpack a little bit of what you're digging into in that particular paper?
Yeah, excuse me. That paper was presented at the Society of Pentecostal Studies 45th annual meeting, so I think 2 or 3 years ago. And the theme for that year was Pentecostal Worship in the Arts. And so, you know, part of my journey and experience, you know, based on the principle of koinonia, you know, where every member of the body not only belongs, but is also needed, has been a discovery of the different streams in the life of the church and trying to take them in. So the earlier Eastern traditions has also been one of those streams that I've gotten exposed to. And so, you know, when I talk about the earlier, more Eastern traditions, I'm not talking about Orthodox church ecclesiality, you know, how the Orthodox churches work. I don't know that much about that. I have fellowship with Orthodox leaders in the church, but I don't know. I'm really talking about just the earlier theological tradition. And I'm not suggesting these early, more Eastern traditions are, you know, superior to or perfect at all. But I think they do have contributions, and we're not often exposed to them. So in this Society of Pentecostal Studies annual meeting that was focusing on Pentecostal worship in the arts, one of the people in the history group said, "Hey, could you do something that talks about some of the early Eastern traditions, value of beauty, and you know, the use of icons?" And I said, "I'd love to do that." You know, so that's what this paper is.
Okay.
And so it I think I'm trying to relate it, in such a way as Pentecostals, we could look at what the early, more Eastern tradition said about certain aspects of worship and the arts, and see if that can enrich what we're doing as Pentecostals. So I think I start out the piece talking about my Greek Orthodox friend Teddy Pappas and some of my experiences with him, and then I sort of lay theological and dogmatic framework so people can understand kind of these discussions, and then focus on really the Seventh Ecumenical Council at Nicaea and the question of the veneration of icons and all that represents, because it represents a view of materiality. It represents a value of beauty. It represents a sensory approach also to spirituality, that we don't access God and the Spirit apart from materiality, but actually through it. And then at the end of the paper, try to make some suggestions for how that can, enrich and inform Pentecostal worship of the arts. And, another thing I suggest in that paper is that that Pentecostal worship and Pentecostal spirituality affirms materiality and bodily movement and a holistic engagement of the individual, not just rational, logical, empirical thought, which we also value, but the Pentecostals also value the super-rational. And so I thought that was an interesting kind of dialogue. So that's what the paper is, essentially, I think.
Now, I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into this about materiality, because it is intriguing to me, both as someone who reads the Bible constantly, especially when you're reading the First Testament, the Old Testament, how it is very much materially driven. I mean, they are experiencing God through the sacrifices, through the incense, through the rituals. They are really going through that. And then, it seems like we in the modern church, we've actually bought more into a Kantian view of everything just must be rational or mind or spirit, immaterial. Explain that. How does that really work itself out in the worship of the church and of the individual Christian? What role do you see materiality playing that would actually benefit a believer or a congregation in its worship?
Right. So, excuse me. One thing I've discovered in just looking at the historical development of the churches is that, for the most part, if not entirely, pews weren't introduced till 1500, the period of the Reformation. And so I think earlier, more ancient Christian worship tended to be more holistic than some of the kinds of worship we've inherited in the modern West. That is pretty cranial, that a church service can feel like a school classroom. And we're holistic composite beings. We're not just brains. We do have a brain, but God gave us emotions also. God gave us senses, physical senses. God gave us instinct. God gave us physicality. We're embodied. So I think traditionally, yeah, you're right. Like in the Old Testament, all of the senses are utilized, and the people move and they walk and they and they do all these things. They go on a pilgrimage. And then I think when you look at the early churches, their worship services also and their spirituality, was also like this.
Mm-hmm.
It was more holistic in materiality. So for our church, I even mentioned in this article from the SPS paper, in our church, we're journeying, trying to recover some of our, bodily participation in the
Right.
service. And by the way, Pentecostals have always done this.
Right.
I mean, a Pentecostal worship service, man, you are moving around. You are, closing your eyes. You're lifting your hands. You're laying hands on people.
Mm-hmm.
People get anointed with oil. It's one of the things that is attractive about Pentecostalism.
Yeah.
It's more holistic. And so, and you referenced different kinds of spiritualities. There's a spirituality that emphasizes stepping away from the material, from the sensory,
Mm-hmm.
from the visual, from the the olfactory aspect, the touch.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how we get in touch with God. And yes, we need to detach ourselves from unhealthy attachments or enmeshments. That is true. But that doesn't mean that we must retreat from physicality or materiality
Mm-hmm.
to connect with God or to be saved. I mean, look at the Gospel of Luke. One of the great emphases in the Gospel of Luke is the materiality of salvation.
Mm-hmm.
When he goes to Zacchaeus' house, and Zacchaeus, of course, is caught up in this, he's taking more money from his neighbors. He's working for the occupiers, first
Right.
of all, but he's also taking more money from his neighbors than he should. He's trapped in this. And so when Zacchaeus gives his speech, he says, I have an announcement to make. I'm going to give half my goods to the poor. And if I've taken more from someone than I should have, I restore it fourfold. And Jesus says, truly I say to you, today salvation has come to this house. In as much as this one also is a child of Abraham. And, in his treatment of John the Baptist's baptisms,
Mm-hmm.
there's something physical, material to do in the repentance in Luke. Right. Matthew would agree, but doesn't have that element in there, and so forth. So it really is a spirituality that, in fact, I think in this paper on Beauty, Material, and Space, I have a quote from John of Damascus. No, it's a quote from a John of Damascus scholar who says, John is the proponent not of a spirituality that connects with God apart from sensory materiality, but one that connects with God through it.
Right.
And that is a very strong aspect of traditional and early more Eastern Christian theology.
Right.
And I talk about some of the theology that goes into that in both of these papers. So in our church, we've been trying to feel our way. People don't want to just sit in a classroom for an hour.
Right.
And so what are some kinds of movement and physical activity and touch and that we can do together before God? Right. And in our personal lives as well.
How are you implementing that as you are exploring this in your local congregation? How are you doing this? I think when I'm thinking, within a Pentecostal context, my early days in Pentecostal churches, we did Jericho marches around the church, but I think you're probably talking about something maybe a little different or beyond something like a Jericho march. But so how are you exploring?
A Jericho march, yeah, well, Jericho march would be an example of this.
Right.
Absolutely an example of this. And the early Pentecostals had an intuition about, these dimensions of human and Christian experience. And, it's very interesting. Harvey Cox wrote a book called Fire from Heaven.
Mm-hmm. And
he examines Pentecostalism as a forerunner of a more postmodern mentality. That could be argued, but it's certainly reconnecting with some more primal and pre-modern elements that are important for people, you know?
This is true.
So, yeah, so the Jericho March is a perfect example of it. You know, I attended 2 Easters ago, the Easter worship service of the local Serbian Orthodox Church, and I'm friends with the priest there, who's a bit of a Maximus scholar, by the way. But, man, first of all, that service was an all-night service. I mean, it began officially at midnight. But again, you had all this movement, all these smells, different people doing things. But one of the things was we walked out of the church, walked around the neighborhood, and then came back into the church. And there were things we were doing because of that. So, you know, Noah, I think a Jericho March. But for our church, we're just sort of feeling our way into a few of these things that sort of work for us. Like one of the first things we recovered for us was just anointing people with oil in the service.
Right.
People that were sick or that felt they wanted a touch of the Spirit, you know, and things they're facing for empowerment. So not every Sunday, but often we'll include the anointing of oil in the prayer time. The people come forward, be anointed, and you know, we laugh about it on the staff because we say, "Oh, should we make available anointing with oil for people this Sunday?" And you know, we laugh every time because we go, every time we do it, over half the room comes forward. So,
right, they're wanting that. Yeah, they're really responsive to it.
They want it. They do it every Sunday, you know. And then I mentioned in the paper too a more subtle thing, but it's exemplary of stuff we're feeling our way into in the Beauty Materiality paper about the communion. So, you know, we it's, you know, of course, the early Eastern tradition and Christian theology, classical Christian theology in general, sees salvation as also a cosmic dimension. In other words, that all the realms of the creation are being reconciled, you know. And so the communion also includes our communion with the created world. So we there's a lady in our church who's got a PhD in anthropology, teaches at the university. She's a really neat lady, and she's done a lot of work on food. And so she makes the communion bread with grain that comes from a local farm, very close to our church. And the farmers there are really neat people. We've had them come to the church, and so the church could meet them. And they're so happy we're creating this connection with the local dirt, you know. And then there's 2 men in our church that make wine, and we use their grapes, you know, to make the grape juice that we drink. So there's a connection also to the earth and to place. So we're just feeling our way in a lot of little ways and trying to do more activities in our church services. But we're not very far along with that, but we're conscious of it, you know. I mean, the fact that Pentecostal churches just sing for a long time bespeaks what we're talking about here.
Right. What got me on this journey years ago was I was reading a series of books edited by Robert Weber on Christian worship. I think it was like a 7 or 11 volume encyclopedia that he had put together. And one of those volumes, I think it was volume 7, had this line in it that said, Pentecostal worship is actually more akin to Orthodox worship. And man, the lights went off in my head that my entire life I'd always felt as a Pentecostal pastor that I was having to shoehorn the theology that I'd been given in the Western context, in a Latin and Reformed context, and shoehorn that into my Pentecostal experience. And that started me down the journey of exploring much more of the Eastern Orthodox theological writers. And part of it was this whole aspect of experience, both the experience of God and the experience of God through his creation, and theologically thinking through sacramental acts, prophetic acts, that the act itself is making a theological declaration, you know, whether it's, you know, a cross, whether it's, you know, we started instituting some of the old traditions, you know, 2 candles on the communion table representing the the two natures of Christ. We would even, we would incorporate a number of those different things, trying to engage the entire person into the act of worship. And it sounds like that's something that you guys are exploring as well. Have you had any pushback or any concerns from people that, I mean, you went to an Orthodox Easter worship service. Do you have people getting afraid that you're going off the deep end?
No, because we don't do a ton of stuff with it. We want people to be able to journey at their speed. We don't. I mean, my wife says to me, honey, with other things as well, she'll say, honey, I watched you take 15 years to think this through. Don't expect people to, come to it in 15 minutes.
This is wisdom.
Between my wife and the Holy Spirit, there's a hope for my ministry. But
man, this is wisdom.
But so not really. We sort of journey communally, and it's people like it. They might make private jokes about my affinity for also ancient tradition, but I don't really know about that.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about, Jeff. Yeah, you're a couple things. In this beauty materiality paper, I cite a guy named Edward Rybarczyk. So he teaches at Vanguard University Assemblies of God School in L.A. He wrote a 2004 book entitled Beyond Salvation, Eastern Orthodoxy and Classical Pentecostalism. And so he argues that there's quite a bit of significant affinity between early ancient Eastern tradition and Pentecostalism. Also, I mentioned in this paper that Wesley scholars have pointed out that Wesley not only knew the Eastern Fathers, but preferred the Eastern Fathers to the Western Fathers.
Right.
So you'll see, Wesley's the first one in the modern time that put these stages of salvation in. And those are reflective of the three-stage spiritual development model from the early churches that goes on through to this day in Orthodoxy. That's just a foundational aspect of the spirituality. So all that to say that, I think early Eastern tradition is Pentecostalism is kind of a cousin of it. There's some affinity there and connectivity, as you were intimating. And your comment on the sacramental nature of the creation that we're in the middle of, that's one of the things it means. We live in an iconographic universe, This and it's a principle, it's based on the incarnation.
Right.
Incarnation says this. We are saved through materiality, and God embraces materiality. But a little thing I'll say to people sometimes that I think captures some of the significance and import and spirit of this is to say, icons and idols. Let's talk about them for a minute. An idol is constructed, it's static, it's opaque. You look to it to receive life from it. An icon is transparent, and you look not just to it, but through it to make contact with transcendence, from which we actually receive life.
Right.
So, those that look to idols, and anything can be an idol. Paul says, covetousness, which is idolatry. Anything can be. Those that look to idols become like them. They lose their sensation. They lose their sight. They lose their voice. But those that look through God's beautiful creation to connect with God are enlarged and softened, and we prefer to construct idols and look to them. But a quote I give to people sometimes I love so much, Miroslav Volf, in his treatment of the Cain and Abel story, talking about Cain, he says, the gods we construct for ourselves make statements that allow us to stay the same. But the living God ask questions that provide an opportunity for us to change.
That's good.
Yeah, I really like what Miroslav says there, and it gets at that difference,
Right. Well, this issue of the sacramental aspect of creation, I wrote an article about this recently entitled "Marriage: God's House of Ambush." That marriage is an icon, a living icon of a deeper reality of the soul's longing for God, and that everything around us ultimately is created by our Creator to demonstrate His love and to invite us into a relationship with Him. And I think you do such a great job in the other paper that you wrote on Maximus and the deeper actualization of the apostolic dimensions of Pentecostal movements. And this is and I think it's going to be published in a larger work, isn't it?
It was published in 2014 in a book entitled Blood Cries Out, Pentecostals, Ecology, and the Groans of Creation. And that was edited by A.J. Swoboda. It's the first Pentecostal contributions to eco-theology. And I think it was published in 2014. I actually have the book right here. Let's see. Yeah, 2014 it was published, yeah.
Now, as nerdy as eco-theology sounds, it's actually quite brilliant. And A.J. Swoboda is another brilliant thinker. And I really enjoyed your article. I've read it multiple times. And unpack that one a little bit for us. I know you've already touched on it some, but just this role of eco-theology and its role in the journey of the believer.
Right. So, yeah, that I play off a quote from Lynn White in that piece, and he claims that the evolution of modern Western theology has been complicit in giving Christian people, a capacity to not care about the creation, to objectify it and exploit it.
Right.
But he says also that there are resources within the Christian tradition that will allow Christians to regain a friendly relationship with God's beloved creation, all the other realms. He cites Francis of Assisi as from the West, but then also explicitly the early Eastern traditions. So I picked Maximus. Let's look at this. Let's follow Lynn White's suggestions and look and see. And so Maximus is the example I use to access that early, more Eastern tradition, to see if it can help us. It's a better platform for us to regain a good relationship with creation. So I basically just lay out his cosmology and soteriology, and then the spirituality there, and conclude that this provides this way of talking about the gospel helps us regain. It helps us, it gives us a good platform from which to recover our relationship with the creation. And then since it's about Pentecostalism, I interact with AJ's dissertation, both at the beginning and the end, because he wrote his dissertation on a pneumatological eco-theology. So he had interact with him a little bit, but it's that piece. I think one of the values of that piece is it's a brief but fairly thorough sketch of Maximus's system. And I really haven't seen that anywhere else. Not that my chapter's cool. That's not my point. I'm not a Maximus scholar, but it is a way to access just kind of the system just a beginning access to it.
Yeah, I would agree. I was struck again this morning as I was reading it afresh to prep for this interview, of how thorough you do actually deal with Maximus as a person and his system of approach. And I really enjoyed that. And I thought it was actually a great introduction for people who may not be familiar with him and his work. So good job on that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I use it in classes where I teach this early Eastern tradition. A couple of seminaries I'm adjunct at, and I'll use that, actually this paper, that part of it, as part of people's introduction to that. But yeah, it's not surprising, therefore, that the Orthodox churches have always been forward on this eco issue,
right?
Because they include the creation in salvation, and we believe we're connected and interdependent and interconnected with all the realms of the creation, not just with one another. So
right.
Yeah,
and then that brings out again this fracture that I think has happened in the breakup within the Western branch of Christianity. After the fall of the Western branch of the Roman Empire, when it collapsed, and after that there came up just breakage after breakage. The Roman Church breaking away from the larger global patriarchs, and then reformations and Renaissance and Enlightenment, and it just keeps breaking down, and we've lost that holistic aspect. I think many within the Eastern side of Christianity, they've retained a clear vision of a holistic Christianity. And that's one of the things I appreciate about what you've done in your work here, Steve, is to help us find a pathway back and a language to use to speak about these things.
Yeah. And it's you're not doing this, but I don't think it's helpful to overemphasize the differences between Eastern and Western traditions, because you do have people like Bonaventure and St. Francis.
Right.
The whole Franciscan tradition is very tight, and there's, so, but man, when you get up into the modern period,
right,
we really do start fracturing things. I mean, everything's not separated. I've been saying to people lately, like, our culture that we're living in the Northwestern United States obviously is radically individualistic. It's radically individualistic, but sociologists are now talking about atomization, social atomization, atomized, which is discrete entities that are not connected to one another.
Right.
So, that's really different from the Christian vision of communion.
Yeah. It really is.
This horse has gotten way out of the barn, man.
Yeah, and I think that would be another conversation for us, and it actually ties into my most recent episode that was published, interview with Doug Bursch on the community of God. And I think that's even for introverts like myself, coming to realize this is not about the just being an atom unto yourself, isolated. Right. You must live in communion with the people of God in order to experience the fullness of God's grace and salvation.
Right. We're communal as well as particular.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest thing I think I learned from Maximus, and this is our big piece of the tradition anyway, this idea of simultaneous union with distinction.
Yeah.
I mean, I really think that is possibly the key Christian concept.
Yeah.
It's in Trinity, it's in nature of Christ, it's in body, it's in everything. And so I say to people, Christians believe in unity, but they believe in a certain kind of unity. It's a unity with distinction.
Yeah. And
they will die for unity, and they'll die for distinction. And we need both. We are both. So I really think that's a lot of this stuff I think is helpful antidotes for some of the excesses and lacks of the modern project.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe that as well. Hey, Steve, if somebody wanted to dive a little bit deeper into Maximus, maybe they're going to read your two papers that we'll make available on the website, but they want to dive in deeper. Are there any particular books or a book that you would recommend?
Yes, there's two books that I think are good for getting started, just with a little bit of a feel for Maximus, and I can shoot those two. Although they're both referenced in my Maximus chapter in Blood
Okay.
Cries Out. So one of them is by George Berthold, Berthold, and it's just Maximus the Confessor. And it's in the Classics of Western Spirituality series.
Okay.
And then Andrew Louth, Louth, has a Maximus the Confessor. And both those books have a very good introduction to Maximus, and then they have a collection of writings. And those two would be the best way to kind of just take a little deeper step into Maximus's stuff.
Right. And we'll include links to those in the show notes. Well, Steve, this has been great. I appreciate you taking time in your busy life and schedule to do this little interview with me. It's always enjoyable to talk with you.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks.
Hey, I have one more
opportunity.
question. I've got one more question I ask it to every guest on the show. And it's this: if I had a time machine and we could go back to the 25-year-old Steve Overman, what advice would you give yourself?
Oh, man. Boy, I have no idea. Probably just, relax. Don't worry about it, Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you were a little bit too uptight at that time of your life, huh?
But you need a little bit of that then too. But yeah,
I think so. And then you realize, hey, I need to
yeah.
I need to relax. But it's funny. Of all the shows that I've done, it's about 100 of these now, and I ask the same question of every guest, and they all come back. 90, I would say probably 85, 90% of all of them say something like you just said: slow down, don't take yourself so serious. So I think there's a message getting across, and I appreciate you helping us.
That's interesting.
Communicate that to any of our younger leaders that are out there listening, trying to make a difference in the kingdom of God. They can make a big deal about Jesus, but enjoy the journey. Don't get too worked up about it.
That's very interesting that there's a theme there.
Yeah, there really is. Well, Steve, thank you so much. It's been a joy.
All right. Thank you, Jeff.
Hey, before we go, I want to remind you that you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. Also, I'd like to encourage you to share this episode on social media or through email. Get your friends and family involved if you think it'll help them. And finally, if you benefit from this podcast and or you believe in our ministry of making disciples of nations by developing healthy Foursquare church planting movements, would you consider partnering with us in prayer and even financial support? Go to my website, jeffroper.com, and you'll see the link there that says support our work. We would appreciate it. It helps make this ministry possible. God bless you guys. It's your life. Now go live it.